I'm not a person that would normally get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. In fact, I'm more than likely to actually stay up until 5 o'clock in the morning. But there are people out there that actually get up early enough to be on site, taking pictures early in the morning and capturing iconic sunrises. Today, we're going to talk more about how to make a better sunrise photo on this episode of Behind the Shot. Hi, once again, welcome to Behind the Shot. I'm your host, Steve Brazel. As always, this is the podcast where I try and get inside the mind of great photographers by taking a closer look behind one of their shots, from conception to completion and all the challenges and stories and issues that happen in between. Some post-processing talk in there as well. I've got a great episode lined up for you today. Before we get into the guests, some housekeeping that I need to do. First of all, a quick reminder that the Creative Live discount is still available. Thank you to Kenna Klosterman for that. It's good until the end of May 31st. It's limited to the first 2,500 people, and it's one use per person, but anything in your Creative Live shopping cart, 20% off with the code TWiP20, so make sure you head and use that. Also, if you're not aware, Frederick Van Johnson, in the beginning of this year, relaunched This Week in Photo, the podcast. And he is absolutely killing it. That show, in my opinion, the network as a whole, but that show, in my opinion, is the dictionary definition of what a photography podcast is. And Frederick Van Johnson, in my opinion at least, is one of the best podcast hosts that are in the business, let alone in the photography podcast space. So make sure you check that out. And a quick reminder about TWiP PRO. If you're not a TWiP PRO member, there's a free trial. Go to TWiPPro.com, and it's a great community of photographers. You can get critiques and ask questions. And again, free trial. Go check it out. So that brings us to today's episode of Behind the Shot. And my guest today was actually a recommendation. He was suggested by a Behind the Shot viewer, Robert Ferdinand. And Robert, you've got a D and a T in there. So if I mispronounced your name, Ferdinand, I'm not sure. But Robert, thanks for the suggestion. And Robert suggested that I get a landscape photographer on that he was very familiar with his work. So I'd like to welcome Bryan Hansel to the show. Bryan, how are you, buddy?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's my pleasure having you on the show. And when Robert suggested that I had you on, I went, and I think Robert, if I'm not mistaken, lives in Michigan like you do, or Minnesota, I mean, like you do, and he shoots the type of stuff you do and was very familiar with your work. So I went looking, right? And again, I'm not one to get up early in the morning and shoot these kinds of shots. I wish that I was. I'm just not as dedicated as some of you guys.
Sure, yeah.
But dude, really, some of your work, as somebody who's judged image competitions and just loves photography, right? I love all kinds of photography, even though I shoot weird stuff like concerts. Your work has everything in it that I want in a photograph. So let's start here. Give the viewers an idea of who you are, what you do, that type of thing, what you shoot.
Sure, yeah. Well, my name's Bryan Hansel, and I live in Grand Marais, Minnesota. I'm a landscape photographer. Primarily, most of the stuff that I shoot is in Minnesota, although I do go to a lot of national parks. And then the main way that I make my living right now is through fine art prints, but also through leading workshops. So I lead workshops all across the nation to different destinations at national parks and forests and things like that.
It's interesting because in researching you, I found out that before you got into landscape photography, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but this is what I read about you. You started, before you got into the fine art landscapes and the magazines and commercial work, you started as a real estate photographer?
I did, yeah.
Explain to me how you go from real estate to sunrises.
Yeah, well, the type of real estate I was doing was high-end real estate. So in the community I live in is a vacation community. And I was shooting some pretty high-end multi-million-dollar properties on the shore of Lake Superior, both in Wisconsin and Minnesota. So a lot of those photo shoots would actually include sunrise, sunset, aerial shots. There were a lot of undeveloped properties too. So some of the last large tracts of undeveloped property I shot on Lake Superior for a real estate agent. So.
It's interesting, but now that you've moved into real estate, you've made a mark, right? You've been you've been published and had credits in National Geographic. I've got a list here. Outdoor Photographer, Lake Superior Magazine, National Park Traveler, Ocean Paddler. Now, that one's an interesting one to me, these next couple, actually. Ocean Paddler, Canoe Routes, Adventure Kayak, Canoe and Kayak Magazine. There's a theme there we're going to get into because of the shot that we're talking about, and also Backpacker Magazine. So there's no question that in this outdoor space, you've made a dent, as it were. Do you ever still do real estate?
I don't. I get requests every now and then, but I haven't been doing any lately. I think probably 7 years ago. Well, right before the economy crashed was my last real estate photography session. Because once the economy crashed, there was no real estate selling. So I decided I had to remake myself and started doing the workshop thing.
Well, it's interesting because to me, real estate is actually done correctly, I should say. A lot of people shoot real estate, right? But done correctly, real estate's very difficult to make sure your lines are true, to make sure that the lighting is right. Very, very difficult type of photography. And in some ways, I think light's light, right? So all photography translates into other worlds of photography. But what you've done in your landscape photography is fascinating. And so let's get into the photograph that I want to talk about today, because this photograph, you call it Sunrise on Cherokee Lake, right?
Yeah, right.
So where was this shot?
So this is in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which is actually pretty close to my house. And this is about 2 days day and a half into the Boundary Waters. So for the people that aren't familiar with the Boundary Waters, it's 1 million acres of preserved wilderness in northern Minnesota along the Canadian border. And it abuts against a provincial park that's another couple million acres of wilderness. So it's one of the last one of the 2 designated wildernesses in the country to canoeing. So
when you say day and a half in, you mean hike in? You had to, or riding the canoe in?
Yeah, we canoed in. So the first night we paddled, I don't know, it was a short day, maybe 5-6 miles, camped, and then paddled the rest of the way the next day.
So that's your canoe in the photo?
Yep. Yeah. Well, so I work with North Star Canoe as one of their ambassadors. So technically it's one of the loaners that they give me. So they give me a new canoe every year.
Hey, not a bad deal if you're into canoes. Yeah. So give me some ideas on the technical end before we get into discussing the heart of this shot, right? So what body was this shot with? What lens? What exposure?
Yeah, so this is shot on the Sony A7R2 with a 18 millimeter Zeiss lens. So those are when I'm going light and canoeing, I like to bring the lighter equipment along. My primary system is actually a Nikon, but the Sony's nice and small and fits into canoe paths quite a bit better. And then for settings on the shot, it was f11 and then 1.6 seconds and then at ISO 100.
And that Zeiss lens that you're talking about, the Zeiss Batis, it's a 2.8 lens fixed at 18 millimeter, right?
Correct, yeah.
So when you're shooting something like this, now I looked up the EXIF data on this and assuming that it's right. The EXIF data shows that this was shot at like 6:30ish in the morning, right? So again,
yeah, that
you're
sounds
way
right.
back out there, up 6:30 in the morning. I'm assuming this is a tripod shot.
It is a tripod shot.
Okay, because 1.6 seconds would say it. But when you're shooting a shot like this, is this natural? Did you use filters?
Yep. So I used a Stingray filter on this. So it's a neutral density graduated filter just to bring down the darkness of the sky.
And it divides right in the middle?
Yeah, so when you're looking at the shot that divides right in the middle along the horizon, you can kind of see where the hills come down to the water.
Right, right.
So the primary part of the filter is right there with just the dark part over the sky and then the clear part over the water and the canoe.
So, okay, that explains a couple of things actually to me. And I'm guessing that's how you kept the sun from blowing out.
Yeah, yeah.
So at that exposure, I'm just thinking 1.6 seconds, ISO 100, 2.8 at 6:30 in the morning. This is, to your eye, this is a pretty dark scene.
Yeah, by this point, the sun it wasn't quite up, but it was getting close to the horizon. So it's starting to get brighter out. They call that, not quite the blue hour, which would be 45 minutes before the sunrise. But you could probably squint and maybe read something off of a piece of paper at this time.
You just said something I never thought about before. You have the blue hour, you have the golden hour, but you specifically said the blue hour is 45 minutes before. I didn't know that they were defined in times.
Yeah,
again, I
it'll
don't shoot
change.
outside, so.
Oh, yeah. It changes in time though. So the interesting thing about the blue hour depends on the time of year and then where you are on the globe. But so sometimes it might be like an hour before sunrise when it ends, or it might be 45 minutes. Sometimes it's even a half hour before, but it all depends on where you're at in the world.
What does, again, I want to really focus on making shot. This is an iconic sunrise image to me, and I'll get into why I think that in a minute. But if somebody's going out to shoot a sunrise over a lake, whatever, what advantages does it give them light-wise, a blue hour versus a golden hour versus, of course, you're not going to do high noon and get anything useful. But, why would you choose earlier, later?
You get different looks. So when you're in the blue hour, what I like to do for outdoor shots, at least, is it's a great time to throw a tent up and light it because you'll get a nice blue sky above you and maybe still a few stars and stuff like that. So it looks like night, but yet it's bright enough that you can get the details of the landscape. And then once you start moving past that blue hour towards the sunrise, that's when the colors start happening. So you start seeing the pinks and the purples and all the different colors of sunrise.
That make it as rich as what you get basically in this picture. So here's the thing. Getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning, which I do, when I'm on the radio, I'm on at 7 a.m. I get up at 6 o'clock. Getting up and being actually active and having a camera already on a tripod at that point literally hurts my soul, hurts my brain. But if you're going to do it, my gosh, this is how you do it. So this image to me, layout-wise, purely composition point of view, right? If you look at how it's structured, where the horizon line is, one of my favorite things of this shot is the path that the shoreline takes from the bottom left corner up to the lower third. You've got the canoe as a foreground and the far bank and the fog as a distant subject, right? When you're composing this in your head, I guess I should ask first, was this out of camera, this crop?
This is right out of camera, yeah.
Okay. So when you're composing this in your head, are you thinking about the angle of, because if you had walked to the right, that shoreline would have gone across a rule of third instead of come up out of the bottom to a rule of third. Are you thinking of that? Are you thinking of where the canoe is compared to where the distant shore curves down to the sun, how much trees you have left and right? And by the way, the water that's on the shore adds to this shot a ton, right? It takes away just the dirt or whatever it is and gives it life. Is that all that in your head as you're framing this?
Some of it's intuitive now. So I have actually a 3 method of composition that I like to use. So I do this thing called flow or simplicity, flow, and relationships. So the first thing I'm going to do is I simplify the scene as much as I possibly can. In this case, it's just the canoe, shoreline, sunrise, and then the trees on the side. And then the flow is where your eyes go in the shot. So I pose the canoe at this angle so that your eye would start at the canoe and then work its way out to the horizon and where the sun is coming up. And then the relationships is just how the various parts of the image relate to each other. So the foreground is connected to the sky through the reflection of the clouds in the lake. And then the trees also rising up out of the foreground into the sky helps that relationship as well.
Okay. That took you less than a minute to say, but I have to say, that's a lot of info, right?
Yeah.
So many people would let that 30, 40 seconds go by as, oh, smart. There's a lot of info in that 30 to 40 seconds to unpack. You thought about the angle of the canoe, right? So you want any photography to be great. Don't just go out there and take a shot and go, this is the right angle, right? You make the shot. So you consciously position okay. Did you position the oars?
Yeah, those paddles are actually positioned specifically. So before the shot happened, at night we actually tie our canoes down to a tree and turn it upside down in case there's wind at night, so it doesn't blow away. So you're not trapped on an island in the middle of the lake,
which would be bad.
Which would be bad when you're a couple days from the entry point. So actually, I carried the canoe down from the campsite, put the paddles in there, posed the canoe in the direction I wanted. About 2 hours before this shot, I'd actually done the same because the northern lights were out, and I shot the northern lights real close to where this canoe was as well. So yeah, everything is positioned just to make this shot.
Okay, which then brings in a couple of technical questions. First of all, I guess the question would be the Zeiss lens. Is that thing like the Superman of lenses? This thing is so... I zoomed in on the one you sent me. This thing is insanely tack sharp. And I looked up the price of this thing, and it's only $1,500.
It's a heck of a lens for the price. And the other nice thing, it's surprisingly light. Like you hold it in your hands, and you can't believe that you can get an image this sharp out of such a light lens.
Yeah, I mean, the image is, like I say, I mean, it is insanely tack sharp. And the dynamic range, right? Now I get it because you had that ND filter on there, that graduated ND. But I mentioned earlier from an image comp point of view, this image, dynamic range-wise, has you have the full spectrum in here, 0 to 255. You've got perfect blacks in the right spot. They're not muddied up and blocked out. The highlights, you manage to keep all the highlights in that sunrise because of the ND filter, but also because of the skill to A, know to use it, and B, know how to expose it, right? So from that point of view, the shot has absolutely everything. But there's two things that I've done before and failed. A is the fog. I've tried to photograph and actually keep fog in a scene before, and I have actually failed drastically. Especially to have it look so 3D real, right? A lot of times it looks noisy. It looks... Is there a trick, I guess, is my question, to capturing that kind of low on-the-ground fog?
Well, you'll notice that you only see it in the dark areas of the image. So if you look at that image, there's the hills that come down, and then the fog is like kind of within the reflections. Right. There was actually that entire morning, the entire lake was fog. So there was fog over the entire surface. But you see it because it's juxtapositioned against that dark reflection. So that's why it's popping out there. And then, I do edit all my images. And when I did this one in Lightroom, I came back in and used a luminosity mask just to bring up the fog on the horizon there.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So now look at the canoe. Did you use any artificial light on this scene?
I didn't. It was actually really amazing light right there. The interesting thing about this canoe is it has this thing called shouldered tumble home, which is where the very top part of the canoe falls back in towards the center. And that part of the canoe, I don't know, every time I've taken a picture of this canoe, it just grabs the light. It can be even away from the primary light source, and it's reflecting. It's amazing. It's
and now you know exactly why I was asking. Because the sun is way over there shining at us. And yet there is light on the left side of the canoe and inside the canoe on the right side of the canoe. And it's part of what I love about the image is because there's this mismatch in the ambient light almost. And yet then again, you've got the shore on the left is bright, but then it darkens over on one side. Just the way the light is dispersed is wonderful. But then that brings us to the position.
Yeah, it also didn't hurt that this is one of those sunrises that happens that's 360 degrees around you.
Oh, okay.
So, it's one of those rare, amazing sunrises where you could drop a camera and end up with a great picture.
Well, and oh, let's see what I got. So, plus you've got the clouds, which are acting as a nice diffuser to kind of spread that light around. But is this where you camped? And the reason I ask, I mentioned the shoreline, I mentioned the water. You didn't put the water on the shore, right? That was there.
That was there.
Okay. Your location is perfect because you've got trees on both sides, which adds some symmetry. However, on the left, it's a tree and a bush, whereas on the right, it's more rocky. You've got the angle of that shoreline, which to me is really the huge part of this image. That leading line of the shoreline intersecting with a pointing canoe. Is this where you stayed, or did you choose this position? And when you chose it, what goes through your head?
Well, there's a little bit of both going on. So I have been back on this lake multiple times, and I've actually stayed in this campsite before. And this happens to be one of the most scenic campsites that I've stayed at in the Boundary Water. So I knew what I was going to get when I showed up. The tent is actually probably about 50 yards behind where I would be standing for this shot. So it's relatively close by. But yeah, I knew that I was going to have that nice, rock foreground, the Canadian Shield foreground, plus the trees there. So, we were just crossing our fingers that we would get this campsite when we got to the lake.
So when you get a shot like this back on the computer at home or wherever you are, in canoe ride back home, when you get a shot like this to do in post, you mentioned Lightroom a while ago. Is that your primary go-to for post?
Yeah, especially now that they added some luminosity tools to it. So in the past, I would start in Lightroom and then go to Photoshop if I needed to add any luminosity masking. But now Lightroom handles all that.
Right,
so
in the latest update, actually.
Yeah, in the latest update.
And it's funny because when that came out, I was actually really excited about it. And I have not found myself using it yet. And I think it's because until you just mentioned it, I forgot it was there.
Yeah, it's kind of hidden.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go revisit the new tools that are in the latest. That is if you're a CC member, right? This is Lightroom Classic. I don't believe those tools are in Lightroom CC, the online version. It's the Lightroom Classic desktop version. So just to be clear. So on a shot like this one, what would have been done in post?
I'd have to look back to see exactly what was done in post, but generally speaking, on a sunrise like this, especially with like the Sony cameras, there's so much dynamic range that camera can capture that I typically bring the shadows up, and that brings up a lot of the brightness in the foregrounds. The filter that I'm using here helps quite a bit with that foreground. So if I remember all of the processing correctly, I didn't have to do a whole lot. Sharpened it, brightened up the foreground, added a little luminosity masks on the fog, and then probably actually it looks like I might have desaturated the horizon just a little bit.
Really?
Yeah, because I can see.
Is that why I'm getting such a kind of a so many people overcook saturation and clarity? Is that why it feels so natural? Is because you brought the colors down?
I think so in this case. I notice a lot of the times I'll bring the saturation down right on the horizon of my sunrises and sunsets. I just don't want to overdo it. It's so overdone out there that it's for me, I want to be as close as I possibly can to what I saw out there.
So when you mentioned that you would have sharpened it, obviously you shoot raw, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Do you have standard sharpening settings? I'm sure you do it per image, but standard sharpening average amounts that you use?
So in Lightroom, the settings would be maybe a 35-40, somewhere in there, 0.8. And then on the masking, I'll actually take that masking and slide it over 50, 60, 70. So I'm just sharpening the outlines.
The very edges. And at 0.8, you're not sharpening very thick outlines either, because that's how wide the effect is going to be on those particular edges. Interesting numbers. I don't know many people that stay down around 40, but then again, you're shooting this Superman Zeiss lens that is seriously, people, if you could see this image in person, zoomed in, it is just, even the reflection of the trees in the water is just absolutely fascinating to me. And again, F11, you got all the depth that you need. So when you're doing post, You mentioned you did a luminosity mask on the fog, which answers really my next question, which is, are you more of a guy to do global adjustments, or are you more of a guy to do selective adjustments?
It kind of depends on the image. So I do a little bit of both. So there's a lot of dodging and burning going on.
That was my next question was, are you a dodger and burner?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So I learned in the black and white dark room. So, traditionally dodging and burning was something that we did in there, and, just brought that right into Lightroom with me.
So you dodge and burn, you end up with shots like, you may not know this. I should have warned you ahead of time. I was going to ask this. Do you know on this shot what you might have chosen to burn, dodge? In other words, you look at this shot. Yeah. What is it your head says, I want to emphasize this, so I'm going to bring it up or bring it down to lead the viewer's eyes? In a shot like this, what would you normally at least say, I need to lead the viewer's eye by attacking this area?
Yeah. Yeah. So my primary thing is within that simplicity flow relationship. When I come back into post, I'm always worried about the flow. So I'm using the dodging and the burning for the flow development. But I can look at this image, and I'm not exactly, I can't quite remember exactly what I dodged and burned, but I'm going to guess that I dodged on that bush. So the lower left hand, there's the green bush that's standing out.
To make the green
pop. That looks like a dodge for sure, because I wanted to add a little bit more green to the image.
Right.
And it looks to me that I actually burned in the upper two corners to force your eyes down to the center. So, because the trees look pretty dark in that upper corner, and then we just force the eyes down towards the sunrise.
Would you have dodged and burned to really bring out the light areas on the canoe?
I could have. I don't remember doing that. It was just one of those magical mornings but if I didn't, it probably would have been something I would have considered doing, because when you dodge something, it just makes it brighter and attracts your eyes to it. And in that case, the canoe should be the standout feature in this image. So dodging, on the canoe would actually make it stand out.
Yeah, that makes sense. And people's eyes tend to go to the brightest spot in an image, or the most saturated colors in an image, which is part of the reason I think the ND filter and the fact that you may have desaturated that horizon line really help, because then it prevents your eyes from going straight to the sunset, straight to that far shore. It starts on that canoe, and as intended by the maker, takes you right through the image as you wanted them to. So if somebody is looking at your sunrise images, and people, I'm going to give out the website here in a minute. You got to go check out his work, because Bryan is amazing at what he shoots. If somebody wants to elevate that game, right, that sunrise landscape type game, what would you, as a mentor to those people, tell them is the best, 1, 2, or 3 steps to do, or 17?
One of the first things that I like to tell people is, when you show up on the scene, try to simplify whatever you're seeing to the bare minimum that could represent that area. So for example, in this shot, the bare minimum would be the horizon and the reflection in the lake. So we see the trees on the horizon, we have the sunrise, and then we have this bare minimum shot. And then ask yourself after that, what are you going to add to the image to make it feel like the location you're at? So in this case, Canadian Shield is typical of the boundary waters, that kind of rock that you're seeing in the foreground. And then all of the campsites are typically framed in like trees. So you add that in, and then add the canoe, and you have your classic canoe at sunrise shot.
Nice.
So that would be the first thing is simplify, and then add. So simplify and then add to the scene whatever you need to make it be iconic for the area.
Okay. Now you also shoot, out in the elements, as in snow. I mean, you live in Minnesota, right? You get snow.
Right, yeah.
Boy, we embrace do you get snow. Here. There's one thing I know most people who, for the first time in their lives, go out to photograph in those type of elements, and everybody panics. Do I need to put my lens in a baggie, right? Do the camera in a baggie to prevent, fogging up inside the camera? Do you do anything to your gear when, I'm guessing this morning looking at it was cold. Do you do anything to your gear to have it ready when you go outside?
Typically that's not the issue. Like the only issue for the weather would be bringing it from the cold environment back into a warm environment. So if I would have brought my camera into the tent after this, it would have maybe potentially fogged up, because it was cold that morning. So it was probably in the mid 30s that morning.
So once it gets acclimated, you're fine.
Yeah, once it's acclimated, you're fine. What I actually get asked a lot is how I keep my cameras dry while canoeing. So there's a company called Watershed that actually makes dry bags specifically for cameras. It was originally designed for the Navy SEALs, so it can be held underwater for long periods of time. But it has kind of a Ziploc opening on the top, and then it's easy to grab the gear in and out of the padded sack on the inside of it.
Interesting. So, like any type of photography, I mean, the right camera bag, the right strap, the right... When you're out here, you're shooting on what kind of tripod do you use?
You don't even want to know. It's laughable for this trip. So I have this old...
Now I really want to know.
Yeah, I know. I think it's a slick, I don't know. It's old. It's probably 20 years old and it's beat up. I actually just replaced it with a travel tripod, a small carbon fiber travel tripod.
So if people want to find out more about Bryan Hansel, what is your website?
So my website is www.bryanhansel.com.
Okay. And you're on Twitter. What are you on Twitter?
Just at Bryan Hansel.
Okay. And you're the same on Instagram, right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. And then you're also on Facebook. What's Facebook?
Yep. So Facebook is just Bryan Hansel Photography.
Okay. So that way people can find you wherever they need to go and look you up, check out your website, check out your portfolio, and kind of follow you more. Anything that you've got coming up, any workshops, anything like that?
Yeah. So most of the workshops for this year are filled up. The fall ones are still open, and I have two that aren't open for registration yet, but Smoky Mountains is still open. And then next year we'll be doing Death Valley, Tetons, Smoky Mountain, Badlands, maybe the Black Hills, and there might be one other thrown in there.
Where can people find out about the workshops?
So on my website, if they just go to the website, they can click on the workshop page, and that'll give the list of the workshops.
So bryanhansel.com.
bryanhansel.com.
Get them everything they know. I appreciate your coming on and talking about your shot, man. I love this shot.
Thank you. Appreciate it. This has been fun.
And again, thank you to Robert for recommending that I get Bryan on. Absolutely wonderful. Really enjoyed having you on. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, make sure you drop by iTunes and drop us a review. You can find a blog post associated with this episode at thisweekinphoto.com, and all the past episodes are there as well. Again, check out thisweekinphoto.com and make sure you check out the new revamped This Week in Photo podcast with Frederick Van Johnson. Make sure that you check out TWiP PRO. Until the next time I see you, my name is Steve Brazel, the host of the Behind the Shot podcast, where we try and get inside the mind of great photographers by taking a closer look behind one of their shots. We will see you next time.